Hello and welcome back to the channel. Unfortunately, my audio got messed up on these first few clips, so I'm doing a voiceover. I did some diagnosis with the coolant temp sensor, and I found that one of the wires in my intake harness snapped while swapping the harness over from the 22E manifold to the 25D manifold. Once I found that there was a broken wire, I was able to locate where it was broken and repair it, and the car started right up. My standalone setup for this car is not tuned for this particular engine setup, since it is now dual overhead cam with 2.5 liter heads instead of single overhead cam with 2.2 liter heads. Therefore, the setup would have to be retuned in order to run this engine properly. The way in which the exhaust is routed, which you can kind of see in this clip here, it is pressed against the valve cover on the dual overhead cam heads. This was not an issue with the previous engine setup because I had the single overhead cam heads, but the dual overhead cam take up quite a bit more room. They are slightly wider and the exhaust is pressed into the head. I don't want it to melt the valve cover gaskets or the half moon or just rub over time, and I want to rework the exhaust eventually anyways, so I figure might as well reroute it all now and then get it retuned once it's all done. So ironically, I ended up putting this back on the factory ECU once again, and then I drove it to my buddy's house where he has a garage and a welder, and I got to work. The majority of the work that has been done on this car since it's been here has been during like garage hangout nights, so there's not been a lot of talking and commentary and audio, but I have the headers made up. Right now, I am about to start working on chopping up my diabolical fender dump. I won't be using most of it. I need the flange off for the turbo, and I'll use just the very end of it for the fender dump part. And that is because the turbo is going right here behind the headlight. New location for it, and that's what we're working on. Well, that took forever, but it definitely reduces the amount of grinding I need to do. So, save time overall. So the turbo's going right here. Eventually I'm going to switch to a front mount intercooler, and this will go to the front mount, and then it'll come from the front mount to a rotated intake. I'm not ready to do any of that yet. It's out of my budget at the moment. Since I have to rework the exhaust anyways because of the new engine, I figure I might as well put the turbo where I want the turbo, and for now I'm just going to put some piping over to my top mount. The issue is if I put the turbo exactly where I want it, I run into the radiator. I could put a different radiator in here, but again, I'm trying to do all this on a budget. So I'm trying to do things the best way possible while keeping in mind my budget and trying to stay cheap with everything. My idea is to rotate the turbo just slightly so I can squeeze past here and route over that way. The thing is, there's not a lot of clearance here. I want a V-band right here, but the V-band's gonna take up a decent amount of room, and I would then have to have a harsh angle going out that way. If I went like this, I'd have an easier time for the top mount, but that's not gonna work too great when I go front mount. Moving it back anywhere this way, oriented this way, I then have issues with my fender dump. Here you can see this is where the stock intake came in, and the air filter was in the air box right in here. That's all gone obviously, and this is where I have the fender dump going out. I'd like to keep the same hole because I don't want to cut a new hole in the fender here. Also, it's already chopped up out here. For that exit, I could squeeze it by a little bit more, but also my tires are gonna come up and be more tucked. I don't wanna end up melting any tires or anything, so I'd like to keep it where it's at. That's part of what's making it so difficult here. All right, I want the turbo to sit about right here. I can't put the V-band directly onto the back plate here because the bolts are in the way down there, which means I have to space it out to about here, and then I'm too far past my exit hole there. Looking at it, I don't think I really need a V-band there, honestly, because I think that I can just maneuver this whenever I have to take the turbo out, in which case I only need a V-band on the underside of the turbo. So I think that's what I'm gonna do, is only put one at the bottom. The question is, do I only need one at the bottom, or should I have one underneath the bottom of the turbo and then also on here? Because it'll go from here and it's gonna go up a little bit to where the turbo sits. I feel like I should have two, just because it'll be easier to take it out. I don't think it's really necessary, but I do have two of them. I feel like it wouldn't hurt to just go ahead and put two in there. So this manifold goes in here, just like so. There's room for the oil filter there. I'm gonna reroute this wiring. That way it doesn't, melt on the exhaust.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna do it. I think I'm gonna put a V-band on there. I think that'll make my life easier. I also think it's time to pull that wiring out because I can't even get the V-band in there right now with all the wiring in the way. Alright, so the wiring can come up right here instead of all the way looped and wrapped around. It's actually a shorter distance this way. Now it's not in the way of the turbo anymore, and I can start figuring out how I want to mount it here. I'm getting ready to weld this on. Something I read online is you always want to tighten these, have them clamped while welding, otherwise you could end up warping the metal, and then it's not going to make a good seal anymore. So tighten that down, and gonna go ahead, tack it, make sure that's where I want it, and then weld all the way around. We got a V-band. That's about all I have time for today. I gotta head home, and I'll be back another day.